There are some actors who become famous because of the characters they play. And then there are actors whose voice alone can make people stop and listen. Richard Burton was one of them. His deep, powerful voice became legendary. His performances were intense. His presence could fill an entire theater. And behind the fame, the luxury, the romances, and the headlines was a man who had come from a very different world. Richard Burton was born on November 10, 1925, in Pontrhydyfen, a small village in Wales. His birth name was Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. He grew up in a large working-class Welsh family, far away from the glamorous world of Hollywood. There were no movie premieres. No expensive hotels. No photographers waiting outside his home. Just a small Welsh community, a difficult childhood, and a young boy who would eventually discover that his greatest weapon was his voice. Richard was one of many children in his family, and his early life was not easy. His father, Richard Walter Jenkins Sr., worked as a coal miner and had a reputation for being a strong and sometimes difficult man. The world Richard grew up in was shaped by coal, hard work, religion, and community. But Richard was different. He had an extraordinary memory. He loved language. He loved stories. And most importantly, he loved performing. At school, teachers began noticing something unusual about him. When Richard spoke, people listened. He could recite poetry with remarkable confidence. He could remember long passages of text. And he seemed to understand something that many people around him did not yet see. His voice could take him somewhere else. But before Richard could become an actor, life would force him to grow up quickly. His mother died when he was still very young. The loss deeply affected him. Richard was eventually raised largely with the help of his older sister Cecilia and her husband Elfie James, who became an important father figure in his life. It was during these years that Richard's education and love of literature began to develop. A local teacher named Philip Burton recognized his talent. Philip Burton was not simply another teacher. He became a mentor. He encouraged Richard to read, study, speak, and perform. And Richard responded. He began developing the extraordinary voice that would later become one of the most recognizable voices in cinema. But at this point, he was still just a Welsh boy. The idea that he would one day become one of the world's most famous actors would have seemed almost impossible. Then came the Second World War. Richard served in the Royal Air Force as a navigator. The experience exposed him to a much larger world. But after the war, Richard's path became increasingly connected to the stage. He returned to acting and began building a reputation in British theatre. He was not an overnight sensation. He worked. He studied. He performed. And slowly, people began noticing him. The young Welshman possessed something rare. He could make Shakespeare sound powerful without making it feel distant. He could take complicated dialogue and make audiences feel every word. His talent eventually brought him into the world of professional theatre. And this was where Richard Burton truly began to emerge. His breakthrough came through the stage. He became associated with major Shakespearean productions, and audiences began to recognize his name. But Richard wanted more. He wanted the screen. And soon, Hollywood would come calling. In the early 1950s, Burton began appearing in films. His performances attracted attention because he did not look or sound like a typical Hollywood star. He had a rugged Welsh presence. A commanding voice. And an intensity that could make even a quiet scene feel enormous. But success brought new pressures. The film industry wanted stars. The public wanted stories. And Richard Burton's private life would eventually become almost as famous as his career. There would be marriages. There would be enormous success. There would be wealth. There would be controversy. And there would be one relationship that would dominate the headlines for years. Elizabeth Taylor. But before that chapter began, Richard Burton still had something to prove. He needed to establish himself as more than a promising British actor. He needed to become a star. And he was about to enter the period that would completely change his life. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Richard Burton had become a major international actor. His performances were receiving serious critical attention. His voice was unforgettable. His presence was undeniable. But fame came with a price. The more successful Richard became, the more complicated his personal life became. He was ambitious. He was passionate. He could be charming. He could also be unpredictable. And he carried a powerful desire to live life on his own terms. Then came the role that would introduce him to audiences on an entirely different level. And soon, Richard Burton would meet the woman who would become one of the most important and complicated figures in his life. Their relationship would become one of the most famous love stories in Hollywood history. But it would also become a story of passion, conflict, separation, reunion, and heartbreak. And Richard Burton's journey was only beginning. By the beginning of the 1960s, Richard Burton was no longer simply a talented Welsh actor. He was an international star. His voice had become his signature. His performances had earned him respect. And his name was beginning to appear alongside the biggest stars of the era. But behind the success was a complicated man. Richard Burton wanted greatness. He wanted recognition. And he wanted to prove that a man from a small Welsh village could stand among the most celebrated actors in the world. His career was moving rapidly. But his personal life was changing just as quickly. In 1949, Richard had married Sybil Williams. Their marriage produced 2 daughters, Kate and Jessica. For a time, Burton had what appeared to be a traditional family life. But Hollywood and international fame began pulling him in another direction. The more successful he became, the more demanding his career became. He was constantly traveling. He was performing on stage. He was making films. And his growing fame brought him into contact with some of the biggest names in entertainment. Then, in 1962, Richard Burton accepted a role in a film that would become one of the most famous productions in cinema history. The film was Cleopatra. And his co-star was Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was already one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. She was beautiful, famous, wealthy, and constantly surrounded by public attention. Richard Burton was different. He was known for his powerful acting and unmistakable voice. When the two met, there was an immediate intensity between them. Neither was simply another ordinary actor on a movie set. They were 2 enormous personalities. And the public quickly became fascinated. The production of Cleopatra was already one of the most expensive and ambitious film projects of its time. But the relationship developing between its 2 leading stars became an even bigger story. Richard was still married to Sybil. Elizabeth was married to singer Eddie Fisher. Yet Burton and Taylor continued to attract attention. Their relationship became impossible for the public to ignore. Newspapers followed them. Photographers watched them. And every appearance together generated headlines. What began as a film partnership was becoming something much bigger. The world was watching. And Richard Burton was entering a completely different kind of fame. He was no longer famous only because of his acting. Now, his private life had become international news. The attention was enormous. The criticism was enormous. And the pressure was enormous. But Burton continued working. His career remained at the center of his life. He appeared in major films and continued performing on stage. His reputation as a serious actor grew stronger. Yet his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor was changing the direction of both their lives. Eventually, Burton and Taylor divorced their respective spouses. In 1964, they married. Suddenly, they became one of the most famous couples on earth. Their names appeared together everywhere. They were photographed at premieres, hotels, restaurants, and public events. They traveled in luxury. They wore expensive clothes. They lived a life that seemed almost unreal compared with Burton's childhood in Wales. But their relationship was not simple. They were both strong personalities. Both were passionate. Both were ambitious. And both had enormous emotional intensity. Their arguments became famous. Their reunions became headlines. Their lifestyle became a symbol of Hollywood excess. And while the world watched their romance, Burton's career continued reaching new heights. His work in films such as Beckett and The Spy Who Came In from the Cold demonstrated that he was far more than a celebrity husband. He was one of the most respected actors of his generation. His performances could be powerful without being loud. He could communicate emotion through a single look or a carefully delivered line. His voice could make even ordinary words sound important. But success also brought another side of fame. Money. Richard Burton was earning enormous amounts. He and Elizabeth Taylor became associated with luxury and extravagant spending. They purchased expensive jewelry. They traveled in style. They lived surrounded by celebrities and powerful people. The world saw glamour. But inside their relationship, the story was far more complicated. Their marriage was filled with moments of deep affection, but also intense conflict. They separated. They reunited. And eventually, their first marriage came to an end. In 1974, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor divorced. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. But not for them. Their connection remained powerful. And the two would eventually marry each other again. Meanwhile, Burton continued trying to balance his career with his increasingly complicated personal life. He had achieved something extraordinary. A boy from a small Welsh village had become one of the most recognizable actors in the world. But fame had not made his life simpler. In many ways, it had made everything more complicated. His voice remained powerful. His career remained respected. But behind the legendary image was a man struggling with ambition, relationships, and the enormous pressures that came with being Richard Burton. And the next chapter would reveal an even darker side of his life. Because behind the glamorous photographs and Hollywood headlines, Burton was facing personal battles that would follow him for years. By the middle of the 1970s, Richard Burton had already experienced almost everything an actor could dream of. He had international fame. He had critical respect. He had wealth. And he had become one of the most recognizable voices in cinema. But his personal life was far less stable. His marriage to Elizabeth Taylor had ended in divorce in 1974. Yet their story was not finished. For Richard and Elizabeth, separation did not necessarily mean goodbye. They remained connected, and in 1975, they surprised the world by marrying again. Their second marriage became another chapter in one of Hollywood's most famous relationships. But this time, the glamour could not hide the problems. Their relationship had always been intense. They could be deeply affectionate one moment and fiercely argumentative the next. The public often saw the dramatic side of their relationship, but there were also quieter moments that revealed how much they understood one another. Both were performers. Both understood fame. Both had experienced the pressure of being constantly watched. And both carried complicated emotions beneath their public images. Richard Burton continued to work throughout this period. He appeared in major productions and remained one of the most respected actors of his generation. But his professional success was increasingly accompanied by personal difficulties. The lifestyle surrounding Hollywood could be exhausting. Long working hours. Constant travel. Public attention. And the pressure to maintain an image. For someone as intense as Burton, these pressures could become overwhelming. His life had changed dramatically since his childhood in Wales. He now lived among celebrities and powerful people. He owned expensive possessions. He traveled internationally. He attended glamorous events. But material success did not automatically bring peace. Burton's greatest strength as an actor was also part of what made his personality so complicated. He felt things deeply. He worked intensely. And he often lived with enormous emotional energy. During the 1970s, his career continued, but the world around him was changing. Hollywood was changing. Audiences were changing. And the kind of films dominating the industry was beginning to shift. Burton had built his reputation through serious dramatic performances. He belonged to a generation of actors who treated cinema and theater as an art form. Yet the industry was becoming increasingly focused on new styles of filmmaking and younger stars. Still, Burton remained in demand. His name carried weight. His voice remained unforgettable. And whenever he appeared on screen, audiences knew they were watching someone with extraordinary presence. But his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor could not survive indefinitely. In 1976, their second marriage ended in divorce. This time, it was final. The couple who had once dominated Hollywood headlines went their separate ways. Yet their relationship remained one of the defining chapters of Burton's life. Elizabeth Taylor would always be connected to his story. But Richard had to continue without her. He married again. In 1976, he married Susan Hunt. The marriage lasted several years. Later, Burton married Sally Hay. By then, his life had become a series of new beginnings. But one thing never changed. He kept acting. The stage remained important to him. And Shakespeare continued to hold a special place in his career. Burton had never forgotten where his journey began. Before Hollywood. Before Elizabeth Taylor. Before the fame and wealth. There had been the theater. There had been Shakespeare. There had been a young Welsh performer learning how powerful words could be. And even after becoming an international star, Burton continued returning to the stage. His performances reminded audiences why he had become famous in the first place. He was not simply a movie star. He was an actor in the deepest sense of the word. But his later years were becoming increasingly complicated. The man who had once seemed almost unstoppable was beginning to face the consequences of a life lived at extraordinary speed. His body was aging. His career was changing. And the private struggles that had followed him for years were becoming harder to ignore. Yet even as the world around him changed, Burton continued working. He accepted new roles. He appeared in major productions. And he continued using the voice that had made him famous. There was something almost poetic about it. A man who had risen from a tiny Welsh village had spent decades speaking to millions of people through theater and cinema. His voice had become larger than his own life. But Richard Burton knew that fame was temporary. Every actor eventually has to face the passage of time. And for Burton, the final chapter was approaching much faster than anyone expected. In the early 1980s, he was still working. He was still performing. He was still Richard Burton. But his health was becoming a growing concern. On August 5, 1984, Richard Burton died suddenly in Geneva, Switzerland. He was only 58 years old. The news shocked the world. A voice that had filled theaters and cinemas for decades had suddenly fallen silent. For those who had watched his career, his death marked the end of an extraordinary era. But Richard Burton's story did not disappear with him. His films remained. His performances remained. His recordings remained. And his voice remained one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of acting. From a small Welsh village to the biggest stages in the world, Richard Burton had lived a life that seemed almost impossible. He had known poverty and extraordinary wealth. He had known professional triumph and personal turmoil. He had experienced love that became famous around the world. And he had paid a heavy price for living much of his life under the spotlight. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story was where it began. Not in Hollywood. Not in London. Not in a mansion. But in a small Welsh community, where a young boy discovered that words could become something powerful. And that voice would eventually carry him across the world. But there was still one question left: after everything Richard Burton achieved, how should history remember him? As the legendary voice, the brilliant Shakespearean actor, the Hollywood star, or simply as a complicated man who spent his entire life trying to become something greater than the circumstances into which he was born. That is the final chapter of Richard Burton's story. Richard Burton was gone. But his voice was not. Decades after his death, people could still hear it in films, recordings, interviews, and performances. That deep Welsh voice had become more than a part of his acting. It had become his identity. But Richard Burton's legacy was never simply about the sound of his voice. It was about what he did with it. He could stand on a stage and transform Shakespeare's words into something immediate and powerful. He could play kings, soldiers, writers, priests, husbands, and broken men. And somehow, audiences believed him. That was the extraordinary quality of Burton. He never seemed completely separate from the characters he played. There was always intensity beneath the performance. Perhaps that came from his upbringing. Perhaps it came from the difficult experiences of his early life. Or perhaps it was simply the natural talent of an actor who understood human emotion. Whatever the reason, Burton left behind a body of work that continues to attract new generations. His career included some of the most respected films of his era. He earned multiple Academy Award nominations but never won an Oscar. For some actors, that might have been considered a disappointment. But Burton's reputation ultimately became larger than any single award. His greatest achievement was the respect he earned from audiences and fellow performers. He was an actor's actor. Someone whose technique and voice could command attention without depending on spectacle. And then there was Elizabeth Taylor. Their relationship remains one of the most famous romances in entertainment history. But reducing Burton's entire life to Elizabeth Taylor would be unfair. She was an important part of his story. But she was not the whole story. Before Elizabeth, there was Wales. There was his family. There was Philip Burton, the mentor who helped shape his future. There was the theatre. There was Shakespeare. There was the struggle to become a professional actor. And there was the ambition that pushed him from a small Welsh village onto the international stage. Elizabeth became one of the most famous chapters. But Burton had already begun writing his story long before they met. His life also showed the complicated side of fame. The public often sees celebrities as successful people who have everything. But Burton's life demonstrated something different. Success can bring opportunities. It can bring money. It can bring admiration. But it does not automatically bring happiness. Burton experienced extraordinary professional success while dealing with personal difficulties. His marriages ended. His relationships were complicated. His private struggles became public. And the world sometimes judged him through newspaper headlines rather than through his work. Yet he continued. He kept acting. He kept performing. He kept stepping onto stages and in front of cameras. That determination became another part of his legacy. Richard Burton died on August 5, 1984, at the age of 58. His death came far too early. There were still roles he could have played. There were still performances he could have given. There were still stories he could have told. But history does not always give great artists the time they deserve. Instead, it leaves behind what they created. And Burton left behind a remarkable legacy. A legacy of unforgettable performances. A legacy of Shakespeare. A legacy of cinema. A legacy of theater. And above all, a legacy of words. Because Richard Burton understood something that few actors ever truly master. Words are not just words. When delivered with the right emotion, the right timing, and the right voice, they can stay with people for decades. That is why his voice still matters. That is why his performances are still remembered. And that is why the name Richard Burton continues to mean something long after his final performance. He began life in a small Welsh village. He came from a working-class family. He experienced loss at an early age. He found a mentor who recognized something special in him. And eventually, he became one of the most famous actors of the 20th century. His journey was not perfect. It was never simple. There were triumphs. There were mistakes. There was love. There was heartbreak. There was fame. And there were moments when the man behind the legend struggled beneath the weight of it all. But perhaps that is what makes Richard Burton's story so compelling. He was not a perfect hero. He was not simply a Hollywood celebrity. He was a complicated human being who happened to possess extraordinary talent. And maybe that is how history should remember him. Not as a man without flaws, but as a man who came from almost nowhere and managed to leave an enormous mark on the world. The young boy from Wales could never have known where his voice would take him. He could never have imagined the theaters, the films, the awards, the wealth, the headlines, the romances, or the millions of people who would eventually hear him speak. But he kept going. And that journey transformed Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. into the man the world came to know as Richard Burton. The Welsh boy became a global star. The theater actor became a cinematic legend. And the voice became immortal. Richard Burton may have disappeared from the world in 1984. But every time one of his great performances is played again, something remarkable happens. The screen comes alive. The words return. And that unmistakable voice speaks once more. Richard Burton is gone. But the voice never truly faded. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy an actor can leave behind. Not simply to be remembered, but to still be heard.